And thank you, Jill, for a really wonderful overview of migratory shorebirds and some of the problems that they're facing. As Jill mentioned, I've been studying migratory shorebirds at the University of Queensland for quite some time. And the reason I'm able to do that work is because of the dedicated efforts of enormous numbers of people, Jill and others, around Moreton Bay and throughout Queensland and around Australia, who've been counting shorebirds over the years. So I really want to extend my heartfelt thanks to those people. We would know nothing about this crisis without the work of those people. So I'm going to tell you briefly about some of the work we've been doing across the whole of Moreton Bay, looking at trends in migratory shorebirds, the threats they're facing, and perhaps most importantly and urgently, what we can do about it. So the vast bulk of what I'm going to talk about today was some work done for Healthy Land and Water, and in collaboration with the Queensland Way to Study group, in which we tried to assess the status and management of migratory shorebirds in Moreton Bay. So Jill painted a really wonderful and evocative picture of the declines in migratory shorebirds. I'm a scientist, I come with cold numbers to back up the story that Jill has taken us through. And those numbers don't look horrifying until you realise their annual rates of decline for some of the fastest declining shorebird species in Moreton Bay. And you don't need to be a mathematician to work out that if you're declining by those kinds of percentages every single year, over a few decades, you're gone, as Jill has related extremely effectively to us just now. These analyses are more than 10 years old. I'm afraid we do not have recent analyses of shorebird trends within Moreton Bay. It's something that's on our to-do list. And of course, migratory shorebirds are travelling over vast areas, and threats to these species could be and probably are occurring in all sorts of different places across their migration. We've been studying these birds from the Arctic to Moreton Bay, and I have to say that wherever we look, we find threats to these birds, whether it's climate change on the breeding grounds, whether it's loss of habitat or hunting on their staging grounds in Asia, or whether it's dogs chasing them around all summer down here in Australia. These birds are really copying it from all directions and in all parts of their annual migration cycle. So the first and most important thing I want to say, really, if you forget everything, don't forget this. We all have a responsibility for these birds. We cannot blame it on China and Korea and pretend that nothing's happening in Australia. That is not the case, and the science does not support that argument. So if you hear that argument, please challenge it, because I think it's completely wrong. We have threats here in Australia. We have major coastal developments that have happened, that are ongoing, that are planned, that are taking out habitats for migratory shorebirds, including our most critically threatened species. We have, as has been mentioned a few times now, threats of disturbance that are constantly, chronically working away at the energy reserves that these birds have. Chronic threats, very hard to measure, but we know the threats are happening and we can do something about it. Development projects in the pipeline, of course, some more controversial than others. And what can we do about this? So what we've been doing, that was the core part of the project for Healthy Land and Water, was to work out what the threats are to shorebirds within Moreton Bay and what we should be doing about those threats. The project was really in two parts. First of all, to look at the distribution of migratory shorebirds across the bay. Where are the important places for different species across the bay? There are a large number of different shorebird species. What are their patterns? How abundant is the prey that these birds are after in the sediments around the bay? And what are the threats to these birds, both on their roosting habitat, so where they're gathering at high tide in large groups, but also in their feeding habitats across the intertidal flats. And what you can see here is a single picture of the monitoring effort that people have put in for shorebirds across Moreton Bay over the last few decades. You're looking at 1992 to 2020, and from north to south, all of the different sites that have been monitored for shorebirds across Moreton Bay by the Queensland Wader Study Group. And you can see in that latitude band corresponding to Palmerston Passage, some significant monitoring efforts across the passage, but also several gaps there, and also really no comprehensive data from Palmerston Passage for around the last decade, despite some wonderful examples of monitoring from individual sites. So I'd argue there is a monitoring shortfall for Palmerston Passage for migratory shorebirds. Parts of it, of course, are quite difficult to access, but it can be done, and it's a real gap in our monitoring. I wanted to briefly mention Joshua Wilson, a PhD student at UQ, is working out how to use drones to monitor migratory shorebirds, both at low tide and at high tide, and is really finding some promising results already with his first field trials underway for that. So this kind of technique may help us reach areas that have been very difficult to monitor for shorebirds in the past. Overall, across the bay, there's approximately 30,000 migratory shorebirds in the bay at present. If you read older documentation, you'll see much bigger numbers. That's because there were more shorebirds back then, and around 21 regularly occurring abundant species in Moreton Bay. So that's the kind of scale of the shorebird populations across the entire bay. And I'm actually going to show you some maps of 3 species, the 3 of which were actually highlighted by Jill as some of the fastest declining species in Moreton Bay. Here is the Bartail godwit, a species that occurs quite widely across the bay, but you can see on the map on the right-hand side, those big blue stars are internationally important sites for that species. The other black stars are nationally important sites. And you can see they're not spread all around the bay. There are certain concentrations for that species within the passage, especially the southern parts, are internationally important sites. So the message is shorebirds don't occur everywhere. They're very specific in the places they like, both for roosting and foraging. Here is the far eastern curlew, the largest migratory shorebird in the world, and very, very rapidly declining. And again, some extremely internationally important sites for this species in Palmerston Passage, but also other sites dotted all around the bay. So really the task is large. There are many places around the bay that are important for these species. Jill mentioned curlew sandpipers disappearing more or less from Palmerston Passage. That's a species that really now primarily occurs in and around the Port of Brisbane, and I'll talk briefly about that later on. What are the threats operating to the roosting sites where these birds are gathering at high tide? Well, we interviewed a number of experts in the Queensland Wader Study Group and gave them giant lists of roosting sites and got them to tell us what the important threats were that are happening across the bay. And these are the 3 top threats: development on the left side, disturbance in the middle, and mangrove encroachment. I shouldn't really use that word. Mangrove growth in areas where shorebirds like to roost were identified as the top 3 threats by shorebird experts across Moreton Bay. And you can see disturbance is a particularly widespread threat and something that was heavily implicated for shorebird roosts in Palmerston Passage. So this kind of information begins to give us a handle on what threats we need to work on and where. And this sort of work can help guide some of our management efforts, at least at a strategic level, and then we can begin to localise those pieces of work. Clearly, there are very different kinds of management response for these different sorts of threats across the bay. And there are a number of other threats that were identified by the experts too. I actually won't go into the detail that's on that slide. We also had a look at feeding areas, and we counted off-leash dogs on the foreshore in some important areas for feeding migratory shorebirds. Here's just one example of that work. It's the foreshore at Nudgee, some big intertidal flats with more than 2,000 shorebirds using it. Those red heat maps on the right-hand side show the distribution of off-leash dogs at low tide. Clearly enormous conflict happening there between off-leash dog exercise and migratory shorebirds. I should add that off-leash dogs in this area has been illegal, but 90% of dogs are off-leash on that intertidal area. Brisbane City Council trialled a formalised off-leash area to try to move this disturbance away from the birds. Unfortunately, that trial failed, and the off-leash area has now been de-designated. A very difficult problem to manage. We also had a quick look in the mud, not in as much detail as we would have liked, but we found very low densities of prey relative to many other areas where this kind of survey has been done around the world. So it suggests that food supplies may be a problem in certain areas of Moreton Bay for these birds, but we really need a bit more work in that area. Just going to finish off with three of the major sort of conclusions that we came to, perhaps one of the biggest was that of those 30,000 migratory shorebirds that are in Moreton Bay, around 1/3 of them depend on the Port of Brisbane for their roosting habitat. And this isn't necessarily designated shorebird areas. This is the active reclamation front at the Port of Brisbane. So up to 11,000 shorebirds can get into the port on some high tides. Now that's kind of good. It's also problematic when you realise that by 2044, the idea is for all this reclamation area, of course, to be filled in and used for port development. So we argued that we need to think very strategically about what the future looks like for shorebirds in Moreton Bay. Do we need some new roosting sites to try to support these birds? Second, we must try to control disturbance and vegetation growth over roosting sites. We've got to take a careful look at that issue and manage it where we can. Finally, we must try to get a grip on off-leash dogs in particular, but all forms of disturbance to the birds when they're feeding. So the end result of this project was a report to Healthy Land and Water, which hopefully at some point we'll be able to share widely, and hopefully it will be of interest and use to those working in Moreton Bay. Thank you very much.
Time for one quick question. There's been a couple of good questions on Mentimeter which are kind of related to each other. Could the dramatic decline in birds observed on the passage sandbanks also be due to a lack of food due to coverage of formerly healthy, clean sandbanks with muds and sediments?
Yes, look, I think we can't exclude that kind of mechanism. I think food supply for migratory shorebirds in various areas of Moreton Bay has been declining. Greg Skilleter has some really nice comparative samples of benthic invertebrates over several years, and there do appear to have been some big declines. So I think declines in food supply for shorebirds is a serious issue, but it's something we really don't know enough about. So we really do need more work in that area.
These two questions are related as well. So what about closing off areas, just like we do with turtle nesting and wild fish breeding systems? Is that an option for Moreton Bay and for the passage?
I think closing off areas would be a great idea if we could really make it work. I think the challenge has been enforcement for many of these kinds of rules. As I mentioned in the Nudgee Beach example, it has been illegal to exercise dogs off leash in those areas, and no matter yet it's been happening. So I think designating closed areas is a useful idea, particularly in areas that are very important for shorebirds. But what we also need to do is look for those conflict zones where there's overlap between disturbance and places that are important for shorebirds, and try to influence human activity in those areas. That may be seasonal closures in some places. It may be awareness campaigns and school visits and all kinds of stuff in other situations. So I think it really needs sort of smart approaches that are really tailored to the specific problem happening at certain locations. Great, thank you.